The city was a mosaic of contradictions, a place where steel towers kissed the clouds, while shadows of hunger stretched endlessly on the streets below. At the heart of it all stood Leonard Whitford, a man who believed he had bent life itself to his will. A self-proclaimed titan of industry, he carried himself with the polished arrogance of someone convinced he had authored his own destiny. Leonard was the kind of man whose very presence seemed to announce wealth. The tailored suits cut from Italian silk, the rarest cufflinks carved from obsidian, the leather shoes buffed so clean that even street lamps could admire themselves in their reflection. His laugh was booming, often rehearsed, the laugh of a man who had trained himself to believe he was untouchable. But beneath that laugh was something else, a hollow echo. Leonard Whitford was not born poor, nor had he ever known the desperate hunger that gnawed at others. He inherited wealth, a business empire, and a ruthless philosophy from his father, a man who once told him, "Compassion is weakness, and weakness has no place in a Whitford legacy." Leonard carried those words like gospel, and with them, he had crushed competition, silenced critics, and bought loyalty. The world around him reinforced his conviction. Doors opened at his approach, banks competed for his accounts, politicians whispered in his ear. Everywhere he went, he was greeted not as a man, but as a force. But fate, as it so often does, waited patiently for its moment to strike. And it would begin not in the golden halls of Whitford Enterprises, nor on the manicured lawns of his private estates, but in the crumbling back alleys of the very city he thought he owned. It was on a cold, wind-cut evening when Leonard's driver pulled the sleek black limousine up to the entrance of a newly acquired property. The building had once been a modest family-owned restaurant, the kind of place where generations shared recipes, stories, and laughter. But to Leonard, it was merely another acquisition, another piece of real estate swallowed whole by his hunger for expansion. The restaurant was set to be demolished within weeks, replaced by a glittering high-rise with his name emblazoned at the top. Tonight, Leonard had come not for nostalgia, but for a boardroom dinner with potential investors, men whose pockets were deep enough to further fatten his own. Inside the half-abandoned building, the air smelled faintly of charred wood and old spices. The kitchen was quiet, its stoves long extinguished, save for a single figure who moved in silence. She was a woman no one noticed at first glance, her clothes plain, her hands worn, her presence as unassuming as a shadow. Her name was Ruth. She had been the last caretaker of the restaurant, working for the family that once owned it. When Leonard purchased the building, she stayed on temporarily, tasked with tidying the space until the demolition crews arrived. But Ruth was more than she seemed. Her eyes held a depth of resilience, a quiet fire forged through years of hardship. While others saw her as a janitor, a cleaner of messes, she carried stories etched into every line of her face, stories of loss, endurance, and a wisdom so old it could not be bought. When Leonard entered the restaurant, his laughter filled the space, echoing against the empty walls. He was surrounded by men in sharp suits, their voices loud with promises of profit. The table had been set with fine wines and catered delicacies, yet there was no warmth in the room, only ambition. Ruth stood quietly at the edge of the dining area, clearing dishes, her movements precise and practiced. She did not intrude, did not make herself known. To men like Leonard, she was invisible, another cog in the machinery of their comfort. Until the moment came. Dinner had wound down, the plates littered with scraps of steak, half-eaten pastries, untouched bread rolls. Wine glasses lay tipped on their sides, dripping crimson stains onto the tablecloth. The investors had grown loud with drink, their laughter bouncing like coins tossed into an empty fountain. Leonard leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He had sealed the deal. Another fortune awaited him. It was then that Ruth approached. She moved with deliberate steps, her voice quiet but steady as she addressed him. "Just leftovers, sir," she said softly, her hand hovering over the discarded plates. "And I'll give you a miracle." For the first time that evening, silence fell. The men turned, staring at the woman they had ignored all night. Leonard's brow furrowed before curling into amusement, and then it came. That booming, laugh. Sharp and condescending. The laugh of a man who saw only absurdity in her words. A miracle? He repeated, mocking. From scraps of food? The investors joined in his laughter, the sound rolling like thunder, cruel and dismissive. To them, it was the funniest thing they had heard all night. But Ruth did not flinch. She did not retreat. Her eyes, steady as stone, held his. Yes, she said simply. And though her voice was quiet, it carried with it a weight that unsettled the room. Leonard leaned forward, still grinning. But beneath the grin was irritation, the kind that bubbles when power is challenged, even in the smallest way. He gestured toward the plates with a mocking wave. Very well, then, he said, still chuckling. Show us your miracle. Take the scraps, take the bones, take the trash, and let's see this. Wonder you promise. Ruth bowed her head slightly, then gathered the leftovers into a small bundle. Her movements were calm, almost reverent, as though she handled treasure rather than trash. Without another word, she disappeared into the kitchen. The men laughed again, pouring themselves more wine, already forgetting her. But Leonard couldn't quite shake the way she had looked at him. Not with fear, not with servitude, but with something else entirely. Minutes passed. The kitchen remained quiet. Then, faintly at first, came a smell. It was warm, rich, fragrant. It curled through the air, weaving past the smoke-stained walls and broken tiles, seeping into the dining room. The men stopped mid-laugh, their noses twitching, their eyes glancing toward the kitchen door. Leonard sat up slightly. The smell grew stronger, filling the room with a comfort none of them expected. It was the scent of home-cooked meals, of hearths and childhoods, of something deep and forgotten. It was not the sterile luxury of catered dishes, but something older, purer, more human. The men fell silent, listening as the faint clatter of utensils drifted from the kitchen. Then Ruth emerged, carrying a single tray. On it was a dish made entirely from the scraps they had scorned. Yet what she placed before them was no pile of leftovers. It was something transformed, golden, fragrant, and inviting. The kind of meal that stirred memory and hunger all at once. She set the tray on the table, her eyes steady, her voice calm. Here is your miracle. The room was still. The men stared, bewildered. And Leonard, for the first time in years, found himself without laughter. For somewhere deep within him, a memory flickered, a forgotten warmth, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. And though he would not admit it, though pride clenched his throat like a fist, Leonard felt it, the faintest crack in the empire of certainty he had built around himself. But that was only the beginning, for what Ruth had offered was not simply a meal, but a doorway, a challenge. And when Leonard chose to step through it, or to slam it shut, would set in motion a chain of events that no amount of wealth or power could control. The miracle was real, but it was not the kind he expected. And the price for mocking it was one he would never forget. The men seated around Leonard Whitford had spent their lives dining in the finest establishments on earth. They had eaten caviar flown in from Russia, sipped wines aged longer than most people lived in their homes, feasted on delicacies that required a chef's hands insured for millions. Their tongues were spoiled, their appetites dulled by excess. And yet, as Ruth set down the dish, silence swept over the table. The food was humble in appearance, almost rustic, yet something about it commanded reverence. The colors, though simple, were arranged with a care that made the scraps look intentional, deliberate. The fragrance curled through the air like a story unraveling itself, awakening something none of them knew they had missed. For a long moment, no one moved. Leonard sat at the head of the table, his jaw locked, eyes narrowing at the dish before him. He had expected a spectacle of failure, something to laugh at, proof that his arrogance had been correct. Instead, he found himself staring at food that looked alive. The investors glanced at one another, hesitant. A strange tension filled the room. To refuse would feel cowardly. To indulge would feel like acknowledging her. Finally, one of them, emboldened by drink, reached forward. He scooped a small portion onto his fork, lifted it to his mouth, and took a bite. The change was immediate. His eyes widened, his posture stilled. He chewed slowly, reverently, as if his very jaw feared to disturb the experience. A murmur escaped. Him. Half a sigh, half a moan of disbelief. The others stared, curiosity overtaking skepticism. One by one they reached forward, tasting the so-called leftovers. And each man without fail fell into the same silence. Forks slowed. Glasses were forgotten. The air thickened, not with laughter but with wonder. Leonard's fingers drummed on the table. His pride resisted, but something deeper pushed him forward. Against his better judgment, he tasted the dish. And then it happened. The flavor hit not just his tongue, but his memory. It was warmth. It was the smell of fresh bread from a kitchen he hadn't seen since childhood. It was the laughter of his mother, long gone, who had once baked biscuits in a tiny oven before his father had stripped all softness from their home. It was evenings before wealth, before ambition, before the mantra of compassion is weakness had been hammered into him. It was the taste of being human. Leonard's chest tightened. He set his fork down quickly, as though scorched, hiding the flicker of emotion that threatened to betray him. The investors had already descended on the dish, their decorum forgotten, their hunger renewed. They ate as though starved, scraping, plates clean, sighing between bites. Ruth stood quietly at the edge of the room, her face calm, her eyes watching not their mouths but their hearts. When at last the tray was empty, the men leaned back, stunned. For the first time in years, they were not talking of profits, not of contracts or dividends, but of something intangible, something they couldn't quite articulate. It was Leonard who broke the silence. His voice was sharp, meant to cut through his own unease. "Parlor tricks," he said, forcing a smirk. "Sentimental nonsense. Food is food." But his words rang hollow. Even the investors knew it. They exchanged glances, their expressions unsettled. Ruth tilted her head slightly. "Food is never just food," she said softly. Her words, though gentle, sank deep. That night, Leonard left the restaurant more unsettled than he admitted. The limousine felt colder, the city streets harsher, the champagne he poured himself later oddly bitter. He tried to shake it off, drowning the memory in work, in numbers, in the language of power he understood. But sleep did not come easily. Instead, he dreamt of the small kitchen of his youth, of his mother's hands dusted with flour, of the way she would hum a song as she kneaded dough. He dreamt of nights when the world felt whole, before his father's voice thundered through the house demanding obedience, discipline, profit. He woke with a start, his chest heaving, the memory lingering like a phantom. And though he tried to bury it, the crack in his certainty widened. Days passed. The investors, once eager to sign, began hesitating. They spoke less of contracts, more of Ruth's dish. They told others, quietly, of the strange night when scraps had become something divine. They returned to Leonard with questions he couldn't answer. Who was she? How had she done it? Could she do it again? The more he brushed them off, the more curious they became. Leonard grew restless. His empire had been built on control, on dictating what others thought, ate, consumed, believed. But here was something beyond his grasp. A janitor, a woman invisible in his world who had made him feel something he had spent his life burying. And then came the whisper. One of his assistants, pale-faced and hesitant, entered his office late one evening. "Sir," she said softly, "the woman from the restaurant. Ruth, people are talking, not just your investors. Word has spread. They say she has a gift, that she can turn nothing into something else." Leonard froze, his pen hovering. "Over a contract." The assistant swallowed. "Some are calling it a miracle." The word stung. It mocked him, echoed Ruth's promise. He dismissed his assistant with a wave, but inside something boiled. A janitor? A woman with scraps? A miracle ? No. Leonard Whitford had spent his life proving that he was the miracle, that power belonged to those who seized it, bent it, wielded it. He would not be undone by someone who lived in shadows. And yet, as night fell, he could not silence the memory of that taste. The following week, Leonard returned to the restaurant under the guise of inspection. The demolition had been delayed. The paperwork tangled, but truthfully, he wanted to see her again. To understand. To reclaim the power he felt slipping. Ruth was there, of course. She always was. Sweeping floors, scrubbing counters, humming softly to herself. When Leonard entered, she looked up, her expression unreadable. Not surprised, not deferential. Simply present. "Back again, Mr. Whitford," she said. The way she spoke unsettled him. No fear, no awe, no hunger for his approval. She might as well have been addressing a neighbor, not one of the city's most powerful men. Leonard cleared his throat, adjusting his cufflinks, his armor of arrogance slipping into place. "You've caused quite a stir," he said. "My investors are distracted. They talk more of you than of profits. You've made yourself inconvenient." Ruth paused, her broom resting against the floor. She studied him, her gaze steady, almost pitying. "Inconvenient?" she echoed softly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps necessary." Leonard bristled. "Necessary? For what?" Her answer was calm, her words deliberate. "For remembering what truly feeds a man, and what doesn't." Her eyes locked on his, and in them he saw no challenge, no rebellion, only truth. And for Leonard Whitford, a man who had built his empire on denial of such truths, that was the most dangerous thing of all. That night, as he returned once more to his empty penthouse, Leonard realized something horrifying. He was no longer laughing. And the question he had tried to silence echoed louder in his chest. What if the miracle was real? For days, Leonard Whitford tried to bury the memory of Ruth and her miraculous dish beneath the mountain of his empire. He doubled his meetings, signed deals with ferocity, and drowned himself in the ceaseless churn of acquisition. On paper, nothing had changed. His name still shimmered at the top of buildings. His wealth multiplied in numbers that blurred across screens, and the city still bowed to his power. And yet deep inside, something gnawed at him. The taste lingered. Not on his tongue, but in his soul. It was a hunger that no Michelin-starred restaurant, no imported delicacy, no wine cellar could satisfy. He tried them all, dining at the finest tables, calling for his chefs to prepare exotic dishes, but nothing came close. Each bite of luxury tasted hollow, flat, as though the flavor had been drained away. It was maddening. The investors had noticed, too. At gatherings, they spoke less of mergers and more of Ruth. Some had even sought her out, returning to the crumbling restaurant with offerings asking her to cook again. And each time the stories grew. She had transformed stale bread into loaves that tasted like fresh-baked comfort. She had turned scraps of vegetables into stews that left men in tears. The word spread like wildfire. People whispered of a woman who could turn nothing into something, who could make the forgotten beautiful again. Some called her a miracle worker. Others, more cautious, spoke of her as a danger, a disruption to the order of things. But to Leonard, she was an infection, a threat to his control. And yet, she was also the only cure to the hunger clawing inside him. On a rain-slick evening, Leonard returned to the restaurant again. The building was nearly abandoned, its walls scarred by time, its future demolition looming, but the lights glowed faintly inside, and the smell, faint, warm, inviting, drifted into the street. Ruth was there, as always, her presence calm, her movements steady. She was preparing something simple, a broth made from bones most would throw away. She worked quietly, as though the world outside her kitchen did not exist. Leonard watched her for a moment before speaking. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, his voice echoing off the empty walls. Ruth turned, her eyes meeting his without fear. "And what game is that, Mr. Whitford?" "You're drawing attention. People talk of you. They whisper nonsense about miracles." He stepped closer, his polished shoes striking the floor with authority. "You've distracted my investors. You've unsettled me. And I don't tolerate being unsettled." Her gaze softened, but her words were sharp. "It isn't me who unsettles you. It's the truth you've buried." Leonard bristled, his jaw tightening. "Truth. Truth is what I own, what I buy, what I decide. You are nothing. A cleaner, a cook with scraps." Ruth studied him quietly, as though she could see straight through the marble armor he wrapped around himself. "And yet," she said softly, "you came back." The words struck harder than any insult. He turned abruptly, his pride refusing to answer, but the smell of the broth clung to him, followed him back into the night, and when he lay in bed hours later, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, the hunger inside him grew unbearable. The following week, Leonard's empire began to tremble, not from financial ruin, but from whispers. Investors stalled. They delayed signatures. They spoke of Ruth's food in hushed tones, as though confessing to something sacred. One man even claimed that after eating her dish, he had reconciled with a son he hadn't spoken to in years. Another swore her cooking gave him clarity in a decision that had haunted him for decades. Leonard's fury burned. He told himself it was foolishness, sentimental delusion. And yet, late at night, he couldn't stop replaying that first taste. He wanted it again, needed it. One evening, unable to resist, he returned once more. Not with arrogance, but with desperation. He found Ruth alone, as always, quietly sweeping the floor. He didn't announce himself this time. He didn't laugh. He simply stood. In the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, pride crumbling in silence. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I want it again." Ruth paused, leaning on her broom, her eyes steady on him. "What do you want, Mr. Whitford? Food or the miracle?" The question cut like a blade. Leonard swallowed hard. His empire had been built on certainty, on never admitting need, and yet here he was, trembling with it. "The miracle," he whispered. For a long moment, Ruth said nothing. Then she set down her broom and walked to the kitchen. Her hands moved with deliberate care, gathering scraps, bruised vegetables, stale bread, bones stripped of meat. She worked in silence, the rhythm of her movement steady, unhurried. Leonard watched, uneasy. When at last she placed the dish, before him it was simple, almost meager. A bowl of soup. He lifted the spoon, his hand shaking. One taste, and the warmth spread through him again, that impossible feeling, that rush of memory and meaning. His eyes stung, his chest ached. For a fleeting moment he felt human again. But this time something else came with it. A vision. Not a dream, not a memory, but a glimpse of something deeper. He saw himself, alone in his penthouse, surrounded by wealth but hollowed by emptiness. He saw faces, people he had crushed, ignored, discarded in his climb to the top. And above all he saw his father's shadow, looming, whispering, "Compassion is weakness." The spoon clattered against the bowl. Leonard gasped, his breath ragged, his eyes wide. Ruth stood nearby, watching silently. "You see now," she said softly. Leonard's voice broke. What are you doing to me?" Her answer was calm, steady, inevitable. "Not to you, Mr. Whitford. For you. The miracle isn't mine. It's yours. I'm only showing you what you've hidden from yourself." Her words chilled him, because deep inside he knew she was right. That night Leonard stumbled back into the city streets, shaken to his core. His hunger had deepened into something worse. Obsession. And as he stared at the reflection of his wealth shimmering in the glass towers, he realized something terrifying. If Ruth's miracle could reveal such truths to him, what else could it reveal, and what price would it demand? Leonard Whitford had always believed himself to be master of his own fate. a man whose fortune insulated him from weakness, whose will bent others like reeds in a storm. But ever since Ruth's dish, the fortress he had built around himself was cracking, stone by stone, meal by meal. He tried to dismiss her as a parlor trickster, some cook who had lucked into a recipe that stirred nostalgia. But each time he tasted her food, he knew it was something more. It was not just flavor. It was revelation. And revelation was dangerous. Leonard began returning to the old restaurant again and again, always under the cover of night, always cloaked in excuses even he no longer believed. Each time Ruth greeted him without surprise, without judgment. She cooked with whatever was discarded, forgotten, unworthy, and each time she presented something that stripped away another layer of his certainty. The food brought visions now, unrelenting, undeniable. One dish made from wilted greens carried him back to the day he first fired a longtime employee without cause, simply to prove power. He saw the man's face, the despair in his eyes as he left with a cardboard box of belongings. A crust of bread transformed into rolls revealed his own brother, estranged after Leonard cheated him out of his share of the family business. In the vision, his brother's voice was not angry but tired. Resigned. Bones boiled into broth became something darker. He saw himself years from now, old, frail, sitting alone in a penthouse surrounded by luxury that mocked him with silence. No family, no friends, just the hollow echo of his father's mantra. Compassion is weakness. The visions shook him. They left him sleepless, pacing his penthouse halls at night, staring out over the city he owned but could no longer recognize. The hunger grew, not for food, but for the miracle itself. Soon, Leonard began demanding it. He arrived at the restaurant not with curiosity, but with desperation. He begged Ruth for another dish, another glimpse, another truth. She never refused, but she never flinched either. She cooked as she always had, from scraps, from cast-offs, her hands steady, her gaze unwavering. And after each meal, Leonard left more shaken than before. His empire began to suffer. Board meetings were cut short. Contracts went unsigned. Investors whispered that the great Whitford seemed distracted, unmoored. Some even accused him of losing his edge. Leonard didn't care. Not anymore. The hunger eclipsed it all. He began to see Ruth not as a janitor, not as a cook, but as something otherworldly, a prophet, a curse, an angel sent to unravel him. And with every vision, the question clawed deeper into his mind. Was this miracle saving him, or destroying him? Then came the night that changed everything. Leonard arrived drenched from the rain, his eyes bloodshot, his suit wrinkled as though he had forgotten the very rituals of power that once defined him. He slammed his hand on the counter of the empty restaurant, his voice raw. Enough games, no more scraps, no more riddles. I need to know, what are you? Ruth looked at him quietly. She did not move, did not cower. She simply placed a hand on the counter, her fingers calloused, steady. What I am, she said softly, does not matter. What you are does. Leonard's chest heaved. I am Leonard Whitford. I built this city's skyline. I bend men with a phone call. Her voice cut through his fury like a blade. You are a man starving, and you cannot buy what you hunger for. The silence that followed was unbearable. Leonard trembled, caught between rage and despair. At last, Ruth turned, and began to prepare another dish. Her hands moved with the same reverence as always, pulling together scraps so small they barely seemed like food. She boiled, she stirred, she plated with quiet patience. When she set the bowl before him, Leonard's breath caught. It was not beautiful this time. It was plain, even harsh. A thin broth with nothing to soften it. He tasted it anyway. The vision hit like fire. He saw not his past, not his future, but something deeper. The faces of every person he had dismissed, every worker unseen, every beggar ignored on the street. The sheer weight of lives he had treated as leftovers. The vision pressed on him, suffocating, crushing his chest until he fell back from the table, gasping for air. When he looked up, Ruth stood above him, her expression solemn. "This," she said, "is the miracle you asked for. To see what you have chosen not to see. To feel what you refuse to feel." Leonard clutched at the table, his face pale. His empire flashed through his mind like a house of cards in a storm. For the first time, he understood that wealth had not shielded him. It had blinded him. And in that blindness, he had traded everything that mattered. Tears burned his eyes. He wanted to deny it, to scream that it was a trick, a manipulation. But the truth pressed too hard. The visions would not release him. The mighty Leonard Whitford, king of towers and wealth, collapsed to his knees on the cracked restaurant floor. And still, Ruth watched, silent, her eyes neither cruel nor kind, only patient, as though she had known this would come all along. But as Leonard knelt, broken and trembling, a single thought flickered through his mind, sharper than the visions, more terrifying than the hunger. If this woman can unravel me, what else could she do? And in that thought, obsession twisted into something darker. The miracle was no longer just revelation. It was power. And Leonard Whitford had never known how to live without seizing power. Leonard Whitford had always believed that power could be contained, harnessed, wielded like a weapon. Every empire he built, every contract he bent to his will, every man or woman he cast aside proved that belief. But Ruth's miracle was different. It could not be bought. It could not be bent. And it was the one thing he could not walk away from. After that night on his knees, Leonard told himself he would never return. He would not give this janitor cook the satisfaction of seeing him undone. Again, he would reclaim his fortress of arrogance, his throne of wealth. But a hunger like that does not fade. It festers. He tried to fill it with banquets, the finest chefs in the city flown to his penthouse, each ordered to create a dish that could replicate the taste, the visions, the miracle. They plated meals of astonishing beauty, towers of foie, grass, rare truffles, caviar like pearls. Leonard ate with fury, forcing mouthfuls past his lips as though he could devour his way out of emptiness. But every bite was ash. He hurled plates against walls, cursed at chefs who trembled before him. Not one of them understood. Not one could cook the truth. The hunger only grew. It was Ruth, or nothing. So Leonard returned, not as a guest, not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror. He arrived one night with men, bodyguards in black suits, the type who usually served as shadows of intimidation. They filled the tiny restaurant, their size and silence choking the space. Ruth did not flinch. She wiped her hands on her apron, looked Leonard in the eyes, and asked only, "Are you here for another meal?" The calm in her voice enraged him. He slammed his hand on the counter. "No, I am here to make you mine. You will cook for me and only me. Whatever you are, whoever you are, your gift belongs to me now." For the first time, Ruth's expression shifted. A faint sadness crossed her face, as though she had seen this moment long before it arrived. She shook her head. "This gift was never mine to sell, and it will never be yours to own." Leonard's voice rose, venom dripping from each word. "Everything has a price. Everyone breaks. I'll build you a palace. I'll give you riches beyond measure. Or I'll bury this place in rubble until you beg for mercy." Her gaze didn't waver. "You don't understand, Leonard. This miracle was not for your greed. It was for your soul, and you are choking on it." That night, Leonard made his fatal mistake. He ordered his men to seize Ruth, to drag her from behind the counter, to silence her refusal. But as they reached for her, the restaurant itself seemed to change. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent that was not of food but of memory. Childhood bread, a mother's stew, a father's laughter long buried. The men faltered, hands dropping to their sides as visions overtook them. Some staggered, some fell to their knees. One even wept openly. Leonard, trembling with rage, pushed past them. He grabbed a pot from the stove, slammed it onto the counter, and spat the words through gritted teeth. "Then I will cook it myself. I'll find the miracle. I'll own it." He threw in scraps at random, wilted lettuce, moldy bread, a bruised apple. He stirred with frantic hands, sweat pouring down his face. The broth hissed and bubbled. The smell sour and wrong. At last he lifted a spoon and forced it into his mouth. And that was when regret struck. Not a vision of memory, not a taste of truth, but a torrent, a storm of every cruelty, every betrayal, every selfish act he had ever committed. Not as a witness this time, but as a victim. He felt the sting of hunger in the belly of the man he fired, the ache of betrayal in his brother's chest, the despair of every soul he had crushed beneath his empire. It was not revelation. It was punishment. Leonard screamed, dropping the spoon, clutching his chest as though the weight of all those lives pressed on him at once. His bodyguards tried to rush forward, but Ruth held up a hand and they froze as if bound by some unseen force. He fell to the floor, convulsing, his voice ragged. "Make it stop. Please, anything, I'll give you anything." Ruth knelt beside him, not cruel, not triumphant, only sorrowful. It was never about what you could give, Leonard. It was about what you refused to give. Compassion, mercy, love. His eyes widened, terror shining in them. He tried to speak, but no words came. His empire flashed before him. Towers of glass, contracts inked in greed. Millions in accounts that now meant nothing. And then, silence. The great Leonard Whitford lay still on the restaurant floor, a man who had gained everything but learned. Too late, the one thing he could not buy. The men carried him out into the night, shaken, silent, their boss broken beyond repair. The city would whisper of his sudden decline. The tycoon who vanished from boardrooms, who crumbled without explanation. And in the little restaurant, Ruth cleaned her counter, washed her pans, and prepared for the next soul who might stumble through her door, desperate and blind. Because the miracle was never for Leonard alone. It was for all who were starving in ways money could never feed.